Harry Brubaker had fallen into the cold, icy waves. An excellent pilot in the Navy. Flying low had its consequences. Thankfully, Mike and Nestor were there to get him. The fate of Brubaker lied in their hands, and they successfully rescued the man from the teeth of the waves. But because of this, he will never forget the icy cold waves that almost swallowed him whole, taking him away from the land and sky. Once Brubaker was rescued, Admiral invited Brubaker inside to have a discussion and said, "Come inside, Brubaker. Cup of coffee?" Admiral took a deep gulp of coffee and studied Brubaker across the rim of his cup. They discussed of the rescue and the men, Mike and Nestor, that helped him. Admiral jabbed his cup at Brubaker and said, "Harry, you're one of the finest pilots we have. You go in low and you do the job." Brubaker grinned and replied and said, "From you, sir, I appreciate that." "Then why don't you stay in the Navy?" said Admiral. "The future for you here is good." The grin vanished on Brubaker's face. "You know how I feel about the Navy, sir." And then Admiral said, "Still bitter?" Brubaker shook his head. "Still. I was unattached. It would be easier if people back home were helping. But in Denver, nobody even knows there is a war except my wife. Nobody supports this war." Admiral growled, "That's foolish, son, and you know it. All throughout history, free men have had to fight the wrong war in the wrong place. But that's the one thing they've stuck with. That's why, one of these days, we'll knock at those bridges at Toko-ri." Admiral then revealed that his wife had safely arrived in Japan, waiting for him. Brubaker was more than relieved. He closed his eyes. He didn't care what happened. Nancy had made it. He loved one girl, and that was her. Admiral commented how war wasn't for women, but Brubaker knew why she had traveled so far from home. They gave up everything, and they had to carry the burden of sacrificing their lives. Admiral argued back, saying that burdens always fall on a few, and sometimes a sacrifice of a few are what keeps society together. Brubaker didn't want to chat anymore, and excused himself and exited the room. Later, the Navy arrives in Yokosuka, Japan. Mike looks around and sees Nancy, Brubaker's wife. He yells, "Hey, Miss Brubaker, here's your hero." Brubaker ran and hugged his wife immediately. He wished that Mike had stayed, for the pain of seeing his woman on the quay below was too great. They had come too far, they loved him too much, and they reminded him too much of the icy Korean waters clenching at him, trying to drag him down. For the first time in his life, he became desperately afraid and wanted to leave the sailboat right then, for he saw leading from the dock of the carrier, above the bodies his wife and daughters, 4 bridges stretched far into the sea, and they were the bridges of Toko-ri, and he was breathly afraid of them. Now was the moment that Brubaker had to get on a plane and head towards the bridges of Toko-ri to bomb them. Brubaker, with the other jets, had successfully bombed the bridges. However, his plane was hit and he was forced to crash on Korean soil. His wingman provided direction of what to do, like a school teacher with a child. The last thing his wingman said to him was, "You pick him up real good, son." He dropped everything and crashed into the rice fields of Korea that were 3 miles away from the village. He started to run because the communists were sure to go after him soon. Within a few steps, he was soaked with sweat inside his poopy suit, and his breath hurt as if it fought its way against his lungs. But he kept running. He quickly found a ditch to take shelter in. Soon, a helicopter that carried Mike and Nestor came to rescue Brubaker a second time. The helicopter landed, and out came the 2 men to rescue him. However, war wasn't a happy tale to recall, as Nestor is getting out of the helicopter to join Brubaker and Mike in the ditch. Bullets pierced through his chest at rapid speeds, multiple, and his bloody, limp body fell with a great sound. The sight was unbearable, and soon enemies approached from behind and clutched 2 grenades towards the ditch. The first Mike managed to throw back, but as he lifted the second one, it exploded and tore his body apart. Now the sky was empty, and the helicopter stood burning out in the rice field, and in the ditch there stood one person. He was alone in the spot he had never intended to defend in war he had not understood. Communist enemies closed in behind and shot his right hand that covered his face. In those seconds, he understood for some reason the purpose of him being in Korea. But that brief knowledge served no purpose, for he plunged face down into the ditch, darkness drinking away his vision. News traveled to Admiral that 3 pilots were dead, one including the finest of them all. He had to inform Nancy about the tragedy. When they arrived in Japan again, Admiral approached Nancy with a letter in his hand. He explained. Nancy, hearing the news of her husband, was devastated. Her cries could have been heard for hours. Her husband was dead, and she had lost him. She had lost him to the greed of war. The burden of being in a war that civilians never even knew about had captured him whole. His sacrifice was taken. He truly carried the burden that only a few had carried for many.